Okay, so I've rewritten this video multiple times, and it's because my perspective on this topic it's bounced around a lot, and I think I've ended up with one that I actually somewhat like, but one day in the future I honestly might just remake the entire thing, but that's not going to be anytime soon. And again, before we continue, I'm not an authority on this subject at all. I'm borderline just making all of this up because it's fun. Okay, maybe not making stuff up, that sounds bad. I'm just sharing a perspective that I have that's probably incorrect. Yeah, it's still, I'm making stuff up. So, world building is a word that kind of leaves a stale feeling in my mouth. Over the past few years, it seems like it's ironically lost its magic, and it's now become kind of like a checkbox on an ever-expanding list of things to define storytelling with. And that's not exactly anyone's fault, it's just the way that things are now, and there's interesting parts that I think people are kind of glossing over on, and they're kind of making world building an element of storytelling rather than what I think it is, and that's this perspective that I want to share with you today. If you stick around for this video, I think you'll leave with a, if not fresh, then at least unique and definitely incorrect perspective on this term. The thing is, world building is an extremely rich and diverse discipline, and it extends further than just the setting of a story. It implicitly links different pillars of storytelling together, but I'm going to talk more about that later. There are entire communities, whether it be online or in person, that are dedicated solely to the love of this discipline, that is, creating a world and everything that carries alongside with it just for the fun of itself, nothing more. But eventually you find that these people do end up creating little stories for their worlds, almost as if that's a natural way to go about it, and I think that's what it is. In some ways, without world building, you don't really have a story at all. And that's not because a story that doesn't take place anywhere isn't a story, it's because a setting physically cannot exist without a story. Think about it. Any setting has to have some backstory, some history, or like some myth. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be. Even if a story takes place in the very beginning of a universe or world, there's a story that happens. And that's not to say that the story that occurs there is like particularly interesting. It's just that it is a story. And all of this is world building. If you zoom out on the timeline of a universe or world, there's a lot of small stories that comprise the big overarching story of that universe or world. And all of these together make one big story, like I just said. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It's kind of just like history, which another word for is lore. And this does bring up kind of the discussion of world building versus lore, which I really don't want to talk about, but it's something to keep in mind. To me, world building and tone are not exactly synonymous, but they share a lot more similarities than I think a lot of people think. While it's possible to have multiple different stories take place in the same world, it's likely that the tones of these stories will be very similar to each other. Let's take Dune, for example. It's not exactly something comedic, but you could try to transform it into something similar to a Terry Pratchett novel, and it could be possible. But the world building is not going to be exactly the same as what Frank Herbert wrote. This new comedic Arrakis is going to have different things going on in it, and therefore it's going to have different world building. So sure, it would be Arrakis, but it wouldn't be that Arrakis. There is a style of world building called soft world building, which I think the best example of is Miyazaki films, and these are Studio Ghibli films. This style of world building focuses on a bottom-up approach of creating a world for a story. This means that the character and the character's arc is basically a basis for the world structure versus the character naturally arising within the world? Well, this is another discussion, and there's so many different opinions on this. It's not exactly irrelevant. These two methods have more to do with the direction the train of logic takes to get to the actual story, which is bottom up versus top down. In my opinion, it has very little to do with if the story is more character or plot driven, which seems to be the common consensus. Both soft and hard world building can have equally as character or as plot driven stories. A lot of people think that world building without a character in mind is essentially hard world building. And while that may be true if you're not careful, it's completely possible to create a soft world without a character first. And while it may also be true that the element that I'm talking about here is actually tone, I want to explain how I think that tone is actually a sort of byproduct of world building, or maybe even the other way around. How? Well, remember how I said that world building links different pillars or elements of storytelling together? I'm going to explain that now. If you've been exposed to any degree of creative writing or anything to do with storytelling at all, really, the teacher probably has explained the different elements of storytelling, which are character, plot, setting, and theme. Sometimes you even go and talk about conflict, whether it be inner or outer, tone, POV, and style. I'll eventually talk one day about how I think that one of these doesn't actually exist, or rather the benefit of it isn't as apparent as people think it is. But for now, I want to talk about how the thing that all of these elements have in common is that they all can be part of world building. World building kind of acts as a host to all of these elements. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's say that there's this planet. Let's make it the moon of a gas giant, because that's more interesting. And we need to add some history here, so let's say that there are ruins on this planet. And the people on this planet have no idea where these ruins come from. They're huge monolithic structures that stretch out way past the atmosphere. And what do these people do about these structures? Let's say that they respect them a lot. They build their main city around the biggest one of these structures that they can find. And they kind of try to explore them, but they're kind of difficult to explore because since the moon is made up of ice and water, there's little to no soil. So they have to develop technology to help them walk around and survive. So what kind of technology do they develop? Is it high tech or low tech? Is it abundant or sparse? And will they ever be able to figure out what these ruins are or what they were for? And most importantly, who even made them? Okay, so all of that was world building, right? Or, well, I don't know. There was characterization, there was plot creation and setting development all in there. And I'm not going to say that you should point to all of that and say, yeah, that's all world building, because that's kind of ridiculous. You have to know what you're doing in order to do it correctly. And if you kind of label everything the same, then it's impossible to know what you're doing. But still, everything that I just did was all world building. It was developing a universe to facilitate a story to happen. Now, I know that I didn't go that in detail in this world building kind of 30 seconds that I went through, but it was very possible for me to name a character and put them and show their arc or whatever, and that I still think would be world building. See, in this, the development of every element facilitated the development of another element, and they all connected to each other, and that's what I'm saying. All of these connections kind of make a network, and what this network is world building. Okay, so at the end of the day, what benefit does this approach really have? And I'm going to be very honest with you, I don't think there is a really big tangible difference or benefit to this perspective. I think it's just kind of cool to think about stories in this way, and that's nice to have, because coolness is a factor that massively benefits the enjoyment and immersion of a story. And anyways, this video was kind of meant to be a soft introduction, because you know that moon that I was talking about? I think that it's a pretty cool place. More videos soon.